Welcome back, everybody, to the Fantasy Hockey Hacks Podcast, a proud member of the Hockey Podcast Network. I'm Devin Davidson, your host. With me, as always, my co-host, Bruce Gunther, John Enns.
Hello.
And not joining us tonight is Tyler Homan, as he is home with the flu, apparently swallowing razor blades, he says. We're back from our hiatus. Guys, it's good to see you. It's been a few weeks. Obviously, we're excited to be back and talk a little bit about the 2023 NHL Draft Preview. And because we're all, I'm going to call us amateurs, if even that, we don't talk about prospects a lot on this podcast. So we brought in a heavy hitter to help us out, Victor Nuno from Dobber Hockey. He's actually the co-host of Dobber Prospects Report and the Fantasy Hockey Life podcast, as well as a contributor for Dobber Hockey's Prospect Report, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and a junior editor for Dobber Prospects. So, Victor, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We're happy to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. We're really excited to be on the show, and you guys have been doing a great job all year, so it's definitely a pleasure.
Absolutely. So I guess, first thing I want to mention here is that this episode of the Fantasy Hockey X podcast is proudly presented in partnership with Dobber Hockey. Make sure you stick around until the end of the episode. We're going to tell our listeners or you guys about how to win one of 5 ultimate fantasy packs from Dobber Hockey. Each of those packs includes the 2023 Prospects Report, the Fantasy Guide, the Midseason Fantasy Guide, and much more. So, Victor, if you've listened to us in the past, you would know that we generally start our episodes with John's list. It's basically just John's shit list of players, past and present, as well as some interesting topics from around the hockey world. So, there hasn't been a lot of things fantasy relevant necessarily, but John, you did come up with a couple things here tonight to talk about.
Yeah. For me, the Hockey Hall of Fame, just in their selection of players, really Mike Vernon. I'm not feeling that pick. I feel McGillney got snubbed again. He should have been in years ago, but here we are still playing the Russian card. The Hall of Fame's for people who deserve it, in my mind. Mike Vernon doesn't.
Okay, shots fired. Yeah, I mean, I was listening to Oilers Now today, actually, and they were talking about that and how if Mike Vernon's in the Hockey Hall of Fame, shouldn't Bill Ranford be there? You can make a strong case he should, right? I mean, yeah, I kind of found some of the selections a little bit interesting. Obviously, I'm really happy that Henrik Lundqvist is there. I think he's very deserving of being in the Hockey Hall of Fame.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
but just the way he dresses should put him in there.
Valid. Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. I agree. McGillney should have been in there, but what do you do? Victor, any thoughts on the Hockey Hall of Fame nominees this year, or their inductees?
I mean, I think it's clear. Everyone's been saying it. McGillney should have been in a long time ago. That seems crazy. And I guess they were citing the geopolitical issues with why he shouldn't be in. I think someone pointed out how, I mean, he literally defected, right? Like he was opposed to all that. So it's like if you wanted a poster child Russian in there who didn't necessarily agree with the politics, it seems like that would have been a good candidate, and they still snubbed him. So it seems kind of unfortunate. I also didn't realize that Mike Vernon was 5'9". That's interesting.
Yeah, that is actually. I didn't know that either.
Oh, I knew he was short.
Probably a little more common back in the day, right? Like in the 80s and 90s, you had a few more goaltenders that were short dudes, and you definitely don't see that as much these days. But do we want to talk about the NHL Board of Governors as well? I threw that one in here. I didn't know, John, if you wanted to include it, but they've decided that they're not. Elliot Friedman reported that they're no longer going to be wearing specialty jerseys in warm-ups next season, and I can't say it's surprising. Like I don't agree with it, but every time a player opened his mouth about something, it kind of caused a shitstorm for every PR team in the league. So I don't agree with it, but I understand why that decision was made. It's not the right decision, but they're just taking the easy way out and they're going to avoid it altogether, right?
Yeah, it looks that way.
It looks that way.
And I kind of like you. I don't agree with the decision, because you look what a lot of the teams did is they had the jerseys at the end of the practice. They take them off and then they'd auction them off for charity, right? So how many charities now are going to get stiffed because the NHL is too not willing to take a stand on something or not?
Yeah, it's unfortunate. It was all for charity, a lot of this stuff, right? And it supported a lot of great causes, and yeah, it's the NHL doing NHL things again, I guess.
Yeah.
And then, of course, as we mentioned before we started recording here, the Calgary Flames, Frank Saravalli reporting a mass exodus of players. Lindholm, Hanifin, Backlund, Tanev, and Tyler Toffoli now apparently available for trade. So that roster
Trash.
to start the 2024
That whole
season.
organization.
Classic John, trash. Yes, it's going to be interesting. So I threw something out there on Twitter earlier today. You guys, give me your feedback. I said Kyler Yamamoto for Tyler Toffoli. Maybe the Oilers kick in some mixture of picks and prospects to try and even out the value and the salary cap. Bruce, yes or no?
Yeah, I'd do it. I like Toffoli as a player. I think he'd be a good fit.
And both players are actually free agents at the end of this coming season. So, John, what do you think of that trade?
I like it. I've never been a fan of Yamo, unfortunately. I've never really liked Toffoli either, but that's just because that's me and I have stupid reasons for not liking people. But yeah, no, I like that. I feel Toffoli could bring a lot more than Yamo could.
Nice. Okay.
Just don't give away the farm for it.
Victor, any input on that trade? The Oilers are trying to upgrade their right side a little bit, and I think Toffoli is an upgrade over Yamamoto at this point.
Oh, definitely. I don't know why the Flames would do that, but that's great for the Oilers, I think. Like you said, maybe if they add something. I mean, the salary is kind of similar, but I think that's a clear win for Edmonton.
Yeah, 100%. They'd have to sweeten the deal somehow. I don't know. Is it a third round pick, a second round pick? How much do you give up to get Toffoli for 1 year and then he's a free agent? But the Oilers are at a stage now, they're in their window, right? So if you can improve your roster, your top six with Toffoli, I think that makes a lot of sense. All right. Before we move on to what we actually came here to talk about, and that's the NHL draft preview, we got to talk about this. And Victor, I'm sorry, but bear with me. So as a member of the Hockey Podcast Network, the Fantasy Hockey Hacks podcast is a proud partner of DraftKings. New customers, download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use promo code THPN. Bet just $5 to score $150 in bonus bets instantly. That's promo code THPN, only at DraftKings Sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In Massachusetts, call 800-327-5050 or visit gamblinghelpline.org. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. In Kansas, call 1-800-522-4700. On behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort in West Virginia, gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit www.1800gambler.net. All games regulated by West Virginia Lottery. Please play responsibly. In partnership with Hollywood Casino at Charlestown Races in Connecticut, help is available for gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. 21 plus in most eligible states, but age varies by jurisdiction. See DraftKings.com/sportsbook for details and state-specific responsible gambling resources. Bonus bets expire 7 days after issuance. One boost per eligible game. Opt-in required. Max $50 bet. 10 plus legal required for 0% boost. Eligibility, wagering, and deposit restrictions apply. Terms at sportsbook.draftkings.com/baseball terms. My apologies to everyone. We now have to read those. So we're going to move on here.
That is. Are we allowed to say bad things about it?
Not on air, buddy. Not on air. So we'll just move on.
I love it.
Let's move on here to our 2023 NHL draft preview and Dobber Hockey prospect report. Okay, so Victor, this is where you come in. This is where you help us out and try and make us look good. The first thing I just want to talk about is for our listeners that aren't familiar with the prospect report. Can you give us a quick summary of what that is, what's included, what sort of information readers can expect to find in there, and anything else you think is pertinent?
Oh, there's so much goodness in there. I mean, if you haven't been lucky enough to digest the information in the fantasy prospect report, it's like the Bible for any deeper league. Everything about prospects. It's got every team by team, like the top prospects, forward, D, goalies, and it has different categories for each team in terms of who the best goal scorer, who the best setup man, multi-category. It's got different, monikers for each one. There's also we did a ranking for all top prospects like skaters that have not played a single game in the NHL. So there's a lot of the 23 guys mixed in with some other guys in there. And we each did our own list, so you can see like my ranking and everyone else's in there as well. So lots of just so much good stuff in there. And then of course there's the 23 guys, the profiles in there for everyone and every meaningful prospect. You'd be hard pressed to find a prospect you're interested in that you can't find in there. And after the draft happens, it'll be updated with all the correct teams for all the 23 guys and integrate them into the teams that they're on. So it's a pretty awesome guide, if I do say so for myself. And it was for the Bible for me even before I had the pleasure of contributing to it. So I would have said the same thing prior to now.
Well, it's a fantastic report. I really enjoyed reading through it every year. I've always been a fan of the draft. I've always watched it pretty casually. And for me personally, actually, I don't play in any dynasty leagues. I'm just really a season-long guy. That's my bread and butter. Victor, how many dynasty leagues or keeper leagues are you in on a regular basis?
We got to change that, Devin. Jeez, come on. I got to get you into a dynasty. That's where it's at. I am in too many, I think, is the answer. I think 12, I think is the number.
Holy cow.
That's impressive. That is
Not to
impressive.
mention, I commission a whole bunch of leagues, including a bunch that we are associated with our Fantasy Hockey Life podcast. And we have this like tiered dynasty system that we have been doing for the last year, going on to year 2. And so that's really fun too. It's kind of like, tiered, like the Cupful or other division, leagues you may have played in, where you kind of like rank up after the season. And so that's kind of a dynasty format for that. It's good times. Yeah. All kinds of different formats, salary cap, no cap. I probably have too many though.
Hey, that's okay. I'm actually really intrigued by it. And I work with a guy. So shout out to Ryan if you're listening. He loves Dynasty. Like that is his format. He fills me in on that stuff all the time. He's in a cap league, and so he's right into this stuff. I think he actually bought another. Is it the Elite Prospects? They've got another document too that they put out. It's like 1,400 pages. He's really into it. So, I'll have to change that at some point. My other question was, how many contributors work on this prospects report each season? There's probably a lot of man hours that goes into it.
Oh yeah, a lot. There are, I believe, around 10 of us. So the main, Peter Harling is the managing editor, and then there's a bunch of other associate editors, and then a bunch of us that just cover like one or two teams, and then there are several people who cover multiple teams, and we'll do a lot of the write-ups. Dobbs does a lot too. So yeah, it's definitely a labor of love, and there's a whole lot of hours that go into it and a lot of different people. And that's what's good too, is that you're not necessarily just getting one person's opinion. There's like consensus ranks there, but you are getting generally people who follow each team really closely and follow the prospects really closely. So they have pretty good insights as to what's going on with the team specifically and each prospect.
I like that you guys put that, you broke it down, right? So there's a consensus rankings, and then it shows what each guy had for each prospect. I think that's really cool. So what's your involvement specifically then? So you said, some guys will cover a couple teams. Which teams are you covering in the prospect report?
Yeah, so up until recently, I was covering the Detroit Red Wings. So that was the team that I covered. Now I've kind of just moved into more of an editor role. And so, but that's who I covered. And then I was also a contributor to the ranks. And so what's cool in the guide is you can see each individual person's rankings, and you can see how some people are really high on some guys and much lower on others. And so that's nice too. I always like that. And you can, decide if you like certain people. You may trust certain sources more or less, and kind of knowing how each person ranks is important. Like for me, I rank really highly on upside. I'm not as interested in players that are just close to NHL already, that maybe have a high floor but a lower ceiling. So I rank more on ceiling and upside, and that's important to know because other guys might rank more on higher floor and like NHL readiness, and so they might have a guy really high that I might have low. And so it's just kind of important to know that it's not necessarily that anyone's wrong, although my rankings are the right ones, so just follow them.
All right, well played, well said. Maybe talk just a little bit about the draft class in general. Let our listeners know, is this a deep draft? I'm hearing this is a pretty deep draft, right? This may be the best one since 2015.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard when when people say that. It's like, what do you mean? Because I think for some people that means you're going to get the most NHLers out of this draft. Okay, that's not necessarily interesting to us in fantasy. I think when some people say that, and I would say about this draft, is that it is deeper in the sense that you have more elite talent at the top.
Right.
Whereas last year you had a few, really good options, but in this draft, if you're picking even between 5 and 10, you're going to get probably a top line player, and that wasn't the case last year. And it's especially deep for forward, I would say.
Right.
Like the top 5 in this draft would have gone ahead of everyone last year easily, and maybe even some of the guys 5 through 10. And it's really weak on defense. The top 5 defenders last year, which I would say were Yerichek, Nemec, Minchukov, Matejchuk, and Korchinski, would have gone ahead of all the guys this year. And even some of the guys who went later might even go ahead of some of the defenders this year. It's just a little bit weaker. I kept saying last year it's the year to draft defensemen, and this year, maybe not, although there's always value to be had. So, certainly a little bit later in your drafts, then some defensemen become interesting. But for the most part, there were so many good. I mean, getting like Christian Kyrou, Artem Duda, Tristan Luneau later in those drafts could have been, those could end up working out really darn well.
So I was going to pick your brain about this later, but maybe let's talk about defensemen a little bit. So I'm kind of going through this, and some of the reports I've read, seems to be the consensus is which defenseman was it? Reinbacher? Was he kind of, you see the consensus top defenseman in this draft, or is that still up for debate at this point?
Oh, it's definitely up for debate. I think what people like about David Reinbacher is that he is so NHL ready. I mean, he could probably play in the league this next year. He played in the Swiss league, which is, if you look at PNHLE or NHLE, one of the highest equivalency leagues out there. And he did really well, as a pretty young player. So I think that's part of the appeal for Reinbacher. Some people will say his offense isn't as dynamic, or he isn't as, maybe he doesn't have as high upside in fantasy. And that's probably true to some extent. There's also people comparing him to like Mo Seider, which, is probably not accurate because Mo Seider's a freak and amazing. But even if he's close to that, right? Even if he's like 70% of Mo Seider, you're laughing all the way to the bank if you get him like after, 7 or 8 in your fantasy draft.
For sure. And then in terms of goaltenders, so this is another note I had a little bit later here, but looking at kind of the 3 that I noticed, and correct me, like I want your feedback on this, but Trey Augustine, Michael Hrabal, and Jacob Fowler, are those kind of the 3 goaltender prospects that are most sought after in this draft, or is there some other ones you'd be looking at?
Well, the reality is that I'm not going to take a goalie probably in a prospect draft unless the league is deep enough that you're picking somewhere in the 30s to 60s.
Right.
So generally not going to, I mean, there were a couple of years back there with Askarov and Wallstedt where I think it made a ton of sense to take a goalie because those guys were just so elite, but none of the guys this year, I think, are that. Someone's going to take a goalie early though, probably like in the second round. And I think for the most part, I would just pass on those guys in your draft unless I said, like I said, if it's really deep. But all of these guys are probably going to be 5 years at best. So if you're making a 5-year plan and you expect Trey Augustine to be in the mix for you, then cool. I like him. I like the US NTDP guys. I think they have a pretty good track record. I mean, Hrabal is huge and has all the physical tools, but I like what's between the ears for Augustine. I think he's very competitive. I like him. But yeah, I didn't spend too much time researching goalies just because all of these guys are going to be such a long wait. In general, you can just find the next Karel Vejmelka, right, and just go with that.
So do you subscribe to the 0G theory on goaltending then?
Yeah, Nate and I, it's funny, I was on Nate's podcast last night, but we've been talking about that for years, never called it that. So I love that he gave it a name and kind of researched it. But Jesse and I always talk about fading goalies and, the value that's generally not there. Like I think there are times where it is. Like we did a startup fantasy dynasty draft 5 years ago, and my first pick was Vasilevsky. And I think there are times where it makes sense, especially when you're picking from all the players and the value in that league where goalies would be scarce made sense.
Right.
But oftentimes it doesn't. And especially when there's a huge weight, like in that league, we already knew Vasilevsky was elite. So there was no question. But
That's right.
there are a lot of times where you don't necessarily know that, and they're so inconsistent. So generally, yeah, I ascribe to the 0G strategy, and especially in fantasy drafts. That year that Askarov was there, I actually did pick him with I think like a 7th overall pick, but I waited a year and I knew that I could flip him, and I flipped him for Sidney Crosby on the way to a championship. So there are times where it makes sense, because even if I don't necessarily want him, other people do, right? And so you can pick that goalie, or you can take that pick. So there might be a time in the draft where, yeah, maybe you take one of these goalies and maybe you don't wait the 5 years, but you flip them for something else.
Okay. Of course, the big headline in this draft is Connor Bedard, and so I don't want to brush over him right away, but is there another potential superstar or two in this draft? I mean, Fantilli looks like, and you had mentioned earlier, you alluded to it, there's got to be at least 2 or 3 guys who would have gone ahead of the top 5 last year. Maybe they would have been first overall picks in other drafts. And being a guy that ranks on upside, how many of these guys do you think can be a superstar level player at the end of the day?
At least 5 or 6, I would say. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Do we see some significant trades at the draft this year?
I hope so. As we were talking before we went on the air, I'm going to be there, so that would be fun to see. They generally don't happen in that high in the draft, but I mean, in the top 10 is what I'm trying to say. But I think with so much uncertainty, that tends to fuel these situations. And this year, there's so much uncertainty, in particular with the Russian players. There's a lot of team scouts literally have not seen these guys, and so that's going to probably create some disparity in terms of who likes who. And there might be, I mean, you hear rumors that the teams are trying to move up to take Michkov, and certainly there are guys after that might happen. Someone might trade up to take, Simishev or some of these other guys. So it's possible. I think it's probably unlikely, but you never know. I hope so. It's always kind of fun, and then especially fun to see who they trade up for. Like when Chicago did that trade last year and they took Korchinski, that was a bit of a surprise for me. I mean, it's looking pretty good right now. He had a pretty awesome season, but sometimes you're like, oh, a trade, cool. You're thinking one guy's going to go and then a completely different guy goes. And sometimes with certain teams, like when Stevie Y does that, or the Red Wings, Minnesota has great drafts, Dallas, you kind of, tilt your head a little bit and pay more attention. And when some teams do it, you're kind of like, okay, maybe I'm not as impressed.
All right, good stuff. The next thing I want to move on to here is player projections, and just talk about the top 10 in this draft. I've got a list here just based on the pre-draft rankings from the prospects report. Of course, starting with Connor Bedard, but I just want to walk through the top 10 here, and I'm sure your top 10 looks a little bit different, but this is just based on, like I said, the Dobber pre-draft rankings. So, number 1, Connor Bedard. Is there really anything we can say about Bedard at this point that hasn't already been said?
Well, he's small. People tend to not talk about that very much because he's so amazing, but he is very small, and that is a bit of a concern going to Chicago. I mean, we all kind of assume that's going to happen, and if they don't get some players to put around him, he's going to get beat up, and he might even get injured. So that's definitely a bit of concern. I can't imagine Chicago doesn't go out and get some competent NHLers to provide him some players to play with. And I mean, I think the goal here is to get some decent players, no one on long-term contracts, but maybe some older vets that provide him some insulation and support, score a bunch of goals, but still lose. That should be the Chicago mantra. Like, let him score a lot of points, but definitely don't win too many games.
One thing I've been just listing the last few days or week or so, but talking about NHL comparables for Connor Bedard. And so, like, in the prospects report, Connor McDavid is the comparison they make. I've heard someone described him as a mix between Patrick Kane and Mitch Marner. How do you view Connor Bedard in that sense?
I mean, in terms of production, it's not crazy to say he's McDavid level, just in terms of like points equivalency, but he's definitely different in that he's nowhere near the skater that McDavid is. He's such a freak with how he moves, Bedard, especially for a smaller guy, is really not that great of a skater, but he's just so smart and he knows where to be, and his hands are so elite that he gets to where he needs to be, and his shot is really the calling card. I mean, I think Matthews may be a better comparable there, just in terms of like the shot and how much power he gets on it, and maybe a little bit of the movement. Although I think Matthews is a little bit better right now, but maybe Bedard gets there. But yeah, I mean, you look at the numbers and like all the comps, and it's just silly. Like it's all literally Hall of Famers or NHL superstars, and sometimes these can seem a little exaggerated, but I really don't think so. You watch him play against his peers. I mean, what he did, years younger than his peers, and it seems translatable, right? I mean, some of the things where he walks through like three guys, like he did in the gold medal game at the World Championships, like that stuff's not going to happen probably in the NHL. But the way he gets the shot off, the way he finds space, the way he creates, and I think that was really impressive to me too. Not just the goals, but like how he was able to work well with his teammates on the Canadian team. Because before, like when he was playing with Regina, it was a lot of like one man show before the World Juniors, but he really showed that he can work really well with his teammates and include them and make them all better. And that's what the elite players do. And so, I mean, there's no real question in my mind that he's going to be amazing, like probably right off the bat.
So that good segue to my next question here. His 3-year probable is 60 goals, 65 assists, and 125 points. For next season, for fantasy, where are you putting his over-under on points? Is it 70? Is it 75? I mean, again, keeping in mind he doesn't have a ton of NHL-level talent on that roster in Chicago. And I think someone else had mentioned this too. This probably is great for Seth Jones's fantasy value next season, especially on the power play.
Yeah, I mean, not having a lot of NHL talent is putting it mildly for the Blackhawks right now. I mean, if Tyler Johnson and Andreas Athanasiou are your best forwards, that's sad. I mean, Lucas Reichel might be their best fantasy forward, and his stocks should go up as well. And I think you're right. Seth Jones probably gets helped. I would put the over and under for Bedard at 64.5. I think I would take the over, assuming that they get some good players.
Okay.
But you have to remember, he not only is a first year player, but he's extremely young for this draft year. So people don't tend to talk about that as much either because he's so dang good. But I mean, the guy's still 17, so he's not even going to turn 18 until July 17th. So he's done all of this super young, and he's going to be a super young 18-year-old in the NHL. As elite as he is, it's still going to be tough for him. So I think in redraft leagues, he's probably going to get overdrafted. Like I would take a surefire 70-pointer over him. I mean, unless he's still there in like the 7th or 8th round, then it's a no-brainer. But I don't think he's going to last that long. I think people are going to draft him in the 3rd or 4th round, and that just seems wild to me.
Yeah, I'd say you're probably right. I think we actually talked with Mike, guys, about this. It might have been last summer, but we were talking about where he should go, and like Connor McDavid came up because I think he was one of those players that got drafted. I mean, and he did really well in his first couple seasons, but he got drafted early too. So I expect no different in redraft leagues for Connor Bedard.
Yep.
Okay, so I think we all know Bedard's going 1. Beyond that, though, things do get a little bit interesting. In my mind, it's Adam Fantilli at number 2, and that's where he's ranked in the prospect report here. Victor, his NHL comparable is Jack Eichel, and his 3-year probable is 100 points, basically 40 goals, 55 assists, right? So, how do you see Fantilli? Do you see him going number 2 to the Ducks, or do you see something different taking place there? Because I know your rankings do look a little bit different, right?
Yeah, so you're hearing all this noise that maybe Anaheim takes someone else. I think it'll probably be Fantilli, especially there's the idea that he can be in your lineup right away. And if they're trying to emerge from this rebuild, I think it makes sense. They have some that, should be coming along. So I think that is most likely, and just depends on how much appetite Anaheim has to maybe take a swing on Michkov or someone else. But I don't know the situation with how many views they've had on Michkov, if they've had scouts there, if they've met with him. Apparently he is going to meet with all the teams, at least the top teams in Nashville. So who knows? I think it'll be Fantilli, though, most likely.
Okay, so we'll move to number 3 here. Like I think Fantilli should go number 2 for sure from what I've seen. Michkov is ranked number 3 here. I've seen all sorts of lists where he goes at 3. I've seen where he goes at 4 or 5. I've seen where he goes, 8 to Washington. I think it'd probably be a mistake if he falls past San Jose or Montreal at 4 and 5. But the team has to be in that right timeline, right, where they can wait 3 years for that player to develop, or for his contract, I should say, in the KHL to expire. And then you hope that he's not signing an extension over there too, right? So there's definitely some risks with Michkov, but is he talent-wise, is he a top 2 or 3 in this draft?
Oh, I think he's in a pretty much in a tier with Bedard, I would say. And if you look at the numbers, if you put Matvei Michkov in the CHL, I think his numbers are just as good or better than Bedard's. And part of it's he's been out of sight, out of mind. We haven't been able to see a lot from him. When he played a year ago at the Hlinka, he was like the best player on the ice. So, I think a lot of this is just we haven't been able to see him and compare. But what he did in the KHL for Sochi was just incredible. And he's got elite offensive IQ and offensive skill. And unlike Bedard is and has an amazing shot, and his other skills are really good. His hands are really good and all of that. I think Michkov, when you look at him, he doesn't have like that one thing that is necessarily elite. Like the shot is good and the hands are good. Everything is just really, really good, borderline elite. So it's like the package together is just crazy. And if you look at like his equivalencies are literally better than any Russian superstar you can think of, like Ovechkin, Kucherov, Tarasenko, like Kuznetsov, all those guys. I know in the guide they put his comp as Pasternak, and I don't like that personally. I think that he's actually closer to Kucherov, just in terms of like everything that he does, just the way that Kucherov sees the game. And it's like if you want someone to score on that elite one-timer, he can do that. Michkov can do that. If you want him to make that seam pass that nobody saw, he can do that too. Like he can just beat you in too many ways. And that's why I think he's like the second best. It's an interesting situation. Like in your league, if you want the elite player that's going to be on your team right away, then you take Bedard, no question. I think if you're like in the second overall position and you aren't necessarily ready to compete, I think it makes a lot of sense to take Michkov because I think he has a higher ceiling. You also have to, we didn't mention this, but Adam Fantilli, as great as he is, he's super old for his draft year. He's an October 12th birth date. So he's almost a year older than Bedard.
Right.
And he's, pretty close to a lot of the other guys. And so that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just means that he might be closer to his full potential already, whereas some of these other guys still have a lot of room to grow. And so that is another reason why I'm a little bit higher on Michkov. And the fact that he played in a pro league, I just think his upside is higher. So if you can be patient, I like him more.
Okay. Well, that's high praise for Michkov. Yeah, and Kucherov, that's a great comparable because he was the best player in the NHL for a 2 or 3 year stretch, right? And still an elite level player offensively. So, okay, I kind of want to go off script a little bit here. So how do you see this top 10 going? Like I've got these players here that we want to talk about in the top 10, but in your mind, Victor, what does that draft order look like next week?
Yeah, it's going to be someone's going to do something crazy. I'm sure, like that always happens. But I have a feeling it's going to be, Bedard, Fantilli, and then that is the real question because we've heard Columbus say they're going to take a center, so they probably won't take Michkov. We're hearing San Jose is going to take Will Smith, but they might take Michkov. We don't know. I think that it'll probably be Bedard, Fantilli, Carlson, Smith, and then the questions arise because what does the Canadian, what do the Canadians do? It sounds like they're trying to trade up, but I don't think their target is Michkov. So, and will they take another small forward? I don't think they do. I don't think they take a Benson or, even like a more Dvorsky. They might take Reinbacher or someone like that.
Right.
That's kind of my thought. So I think a defenseman's going to go, or like 2 or 3 defensemen might go in the top 10 actually. And I think it's probably Reinbacher, and then I think there's going to be centers like Leonard, Dvorsky, Moore, and then maybe another D like Axel Sending Pelika or maybe Simashev, but something like that.
Okay, interesting. Well, let's continue talking about some of these guys here then. So Leo Carlsson, he's going to go high, right? I've seen lots of lists. He goes anywhere from 3 through 5 kind of thing. Maybe not even 5 is that high, but how do you view that player? The NHL comparable is Alexander Barkov. Do you like that comparable for him?
Yeah, I like that comparable. I think Carlson has such a mature game. He's someone who, you just look at Barkov and like what he does. Like he's just so strong. You can't get the puck off him, but he's also very creative and he makes a lot of great plays. He's not just like a boring checking center. And I think that's true for Carlson. One of the things, like comparing him to someone like Will Smith, who I'm sure we'll talk about, everyone oohs and ahs at Will Smith's plays, but you don't pay attention to the ones that he tries that don't work, which happen fairly often. And Leo Carlsson is just better at realizing when he can do those things and when he shouldn't. So he knows when to make the smart, safe play. He's always on the right side of the puck. He's super responsible, but he can make really, creative offensive plays. And it's just his timing with when to do them are a little bit better. And talking about Barkov, I do think Carlson's someone who could win a Selkie one day. He's strong both ways, but has enough offense, because we know that you need offense to win that award. It's interesting too, because, thinking of just like Swedish centers who, played really well in their development years, and Leo Carlsson's numbers. Well, first of all, he played in the SHL this year, and that's something that Elias Pettersson didn't. And his like equivalency numbers are better in the sense of the league that he played in, but some of his star potentials and some of those things like on Hockey Prospecting are a little bit lower because he didn't increase them from year to year as much as someone like Pettersson did. So when you look at this, you think like, oh, he's not nearly as good as someone like that. Now, I'm not saying he's going to be Elias Pettersson, but I think that he's closer to that. I think he's like closer to, Nick Backstrom and Elias Pettersson than he is to, your like William Karlsson or something like that. I think Leo Carlsson's a step above that, and I think he has a potential to be that, top line center with point per game upside.
Okay. Next up here is Zach Benson from, no longer Winnipeg, but from the ice. Smaller player, right? So we've talked about a couple guys here who are smaller. I've seen rankings for this guy kind of all over the map. So, the Dobber pre-draft rank is at number 5. Do you see him going, like, is he a top 10 guy in this draft, or does he fall somewhere between 11 and 20?
I think Zach Benson's going to fall, and it's going to be a tragedy, frankly. He's amazing. And it's the Wenatchee ice. They moved to Washington.
Yes.
Wenatchee, I think they say it like Wenatchee, actually. So, but yeah, so Zach Benson, and I think the guide has his comp as Sebastian Aho, which I think is not bad, but I personally think he's more like Mitch Marner. And he's also size-wise comparable to Mitch Marner. People don't really talk about Mitch Marner's size, but he's not that big. He's 5'11", 170, whatever. Very, very thin, but he's just so smart and so good with the puck and, that creative sort of playmaker, making space. And that's what Zach Benson is. He's been pretty much the best player on that team for the last couple years. And we're talking about a team that has a bunch of guys that were drafted high last year in Savoie and Geeky and, Jaeger, who's, they're all these guys that are supposedly really good. And he's just outperforming them because he's so smart. He knows where to be. He dictates the play. He manipulates his opponents into doing exactly what he wants them to do. And then he goes the other way, or sets them up and then kind of baits them into doing one thing and then goes around them and the puck's in the net before they even realize what happened to them. In Mitch Brown's tracking data set, there was literally no one in the entire CHL that had a better expected primary assist than him. He's just incredible. And he probably will fall just because he's a little bit smaller. And I've heard people like Corey Pronman talk about how his skill level isn't that elite, but I would strongly disagree with that. And so if you don't think his skill level is elite and he's just a 5'10", 160 forward, then he's like not even a first rounder. So He might fall. And then, some team's going to get rewarded with potentially a top line forward like Mitch Marner.
Okay. Will Smith, we've mentioned him several times now, but the consensus in the Dobber top 50 is number 6, and the pre-draft rank is number 6. I've seen him as high as number 4 on some lists, right? Tell us a bit about that player. His NHL comparable here is Clayton Keller. Do you think that's fair?
I think it's fair. Another US NTDP guy. I think he's probably more like Trevor Zegras than Keller, but somewhere in that range. He's in that Keller Zegras range. Will Smith is a player who's all offense all the time, all gas, no break. He's just, he tries all these things. I was kind of alluding to that earlier. He makes some incredible creative plays and just kind of like pull you out of your seat, which is fantastic. And definitely in terms of like putting butts in seats, like he's a guy that you want to draft for that reason. But he's also like pretty awful defensively. Like he basically doesn't play defense. And on that line with Ryan Leonard and Gabe Perreault, Ryan Leonard basically cleaned up all of his messes, him and Trey Augustine and a couple of the defenders. And, he's going with those guys to BC. So maybe he doesn't improve on that, but he definitely needs to play defense to play in the NHL and to be able to do the things that he wants to do. So his offense is elite, but no coach is going to play him if he plays the way he does right now. And even in the college, like it's not going to work. He's got to be more of a two-way player. And I definitely think he can. I mean, at the USNTDP, they basically gave him the opportunity to say, hey, go have fun and score lots of goals. That was his job. His job wasn't to play defense. So it's great. Like he did what he was supposed to do. He pulled people out of their seats. I mean, they won the gold medal and they did what they were supposed to do. And that's great. But to reach his full NHL potential, he has a long way to go. I mean, look at Trevor Zegras, who I would say is still not a good defensive player, but he's still much, much better than Will Smith is right now. And so he needs to get to at least that level to, be someone who can be like a 70 plus point forward. And I think he can get there. But I think he's a little more volatile in terms of like just to be an NHLer. He's a little bit more volatile. I don't think it's like super risky because he's going to get all the time and patience and development he needs to get there. But he definitely has some work to do.
So do you give any weight to the thought that guys that come out of the U.S. National Training and Development Program, like are their values a little bit inflated because they're basically playing on a traveling all-star team as opposed to a guy that's playing in the WHL or the OHL or playing in Europe or something? Like, does that carry any weight with you?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's for sure an all-star team. Yeah, no doubt. And I'll give you a good example. So Grayson Sachin, who played for the Seattle Thunderbirds, was at the USNTDP, and he left to join the WHL, and he had not dissimilar numbers to Will Smith last year.
Right.
Will Smith stayed, obviously, played on this historically good line. All those guys just fed off each other and were incredible. Grayson Sachin goes and becomes the third liner in the WHL and put up a point per game, which is still really good.
Yep.
And people are talking about him as maybe a first rounder, and they're talking about Will Smith as, a top 5 talent. I think if you switch those guys' positions, you're having the exact opposite conversation.
Right.
So absolutely they get a little inflated, but you still can't argue with Will Smith's skill.
Yeah.
I think though, if you look at those two closer, you realize that Sachin and Smith are probably a lot closer than people would like to believe.
So there's some good value there on Sachin later in the draft then.
Bingo.
Alrighty. Speaking of the USNTDP, Oliver Moore, who is apparently the fastest player in this draft class, his pre-draft ranking is number 7. The consensus in the top 50 is number 20. NHL comparables Dylan Larkin. Is that a bit high? Like I've seen some other lists. Craig Button had him at number 16. I think Bob McKenzie had him somewhere around there. I can't remember. And DFO had him in the top 10, but just barely. So what's your take on Oliver Moore?
I mean, you talk about all these guys we've talked about, how sure they are to be an NHLer. Like Oliver Moore is an NHLer, like no doubt. His skating right now, he would be one of the best skaters in the NHL right now if he jumped into the league. He's that good. The questions on him is how good is he offensively? For a long, some of these guys who skate fast sometimes have a hard time adjusting the pace of their game, because at lower levels you can just skate past everybody, and
right.
He definitely did that. What's interesting about Moore is he learned to modify his pace to, learn how to stop and go fast when need to, and slow down for your teammates, and use his really great skill as more of a weapon rather than just going around people. And so that's what makes him even better. And then there's some who argue that he doesn't have enough skill, like his hands and processing speed can't catch up to his feet. And I think that was true earlier in the year, but he showed a lot more as the season went on. And I do think he's someone who can process the game fast enough in order to really, really leverage his speed. I look at
Right.
someone like Andrew Cogliano, who is such a good skater, but I think you could say his hands and processing probably doesn't catch up to his feet as well. And that's the worry with a guy like Moore. I don't think Oliver Moore is Andrew Cogliano. I think he's better than that. I think he has more offensive skill. And I do think that the comp to Dylan Larkin is pretty apt because Larkin looked pretty similar at this stage, and Larkin developed a lot. So it's hard to say, that he's going to be the same. One thing I will say, though, is that Larkin definitely hit and blocked and shot more than Oliver Moore did, but also Moore was a second liner on an all-star team, whereas Dylan Larkin had all the deployment. So it's a little bit hard to compare the situation. I personally just hope that the Detroit Red Wings pick Oliver Moore so they can have two Dylan Larkins.
It'll be a lot of fun to watch for sure. Okay, we're going to dive into a couple defensemen here, starting with Dmitry Simashev. The Dobber top 50 consensus is number 49, so we just made the cut for the top 50. Where did you have him in the top 50?
Oh my gosh, that's crazy low. Really? 49?
Consensus is number 49. I mean, I could be wrong, but that's, I think when I checked, that's what the number was. So,
wow. Let me check my ranking.
And his Dobber Hockey pre-draft rank is number 8, so inside the top 10. I mean, this is interesting because Bob McKenzie released his final rankings. He had him at 19. DFO had him at 15. Button had him at 38. So I'm just really curious where you see this player, and because his ratings or his rankings are just kind of all over the map.
You are right. He was 49, and I was partially to blame there because I had to submit these rankings sometime in like April. So my opinion has changed on him since then, I will say. Right now I have him at number 11. And so the thing about Simashev is he's huge. He's 6'4", but he skates not only well forward and backwards, but laterally. His mobility is elite. And someone who's that big and moves that well has so much projectability and potential. Everyone's going to mention that he doesn't score points, though. Well, he played in the KHL and scored 0 points. That is true, but he literally had one of the best defensive numbers in the KHL, and I think that was clearly his focus. Like, they probably were like, you need to be good defensively or we're going to send you down. And he accomplished that goal. I don't think he was really worried about putting up points. He was worried about being a responsible defenseman in the best league. But when you watch him, one of the best leagues in the world, he has so much, understanding of where the puck needs to be, pushing it up the ice quickly. Like, his transition game is phenomenal, and that's going to translate. So when it comes time for him to play against his peers and to push for offense, I have no doubt that Dmitry Simashev is going to be able to do that. He just hasn't done it yet. So you're taking a bit of a leap, I guess. But if you just look at the tools that he has, it's hard to imagine him not being an awesome fantasy asset and not playing in the NHL, regardless of, his Russian factor or whatever. Like, I definitely would bank on him. And especially if he falls a little bit, man, you could get such good value if you pick him, like, in the teens or whatever. Like, you're talking top pairing upside for sure.
Okay. So Alex Pietrangelo then is a nice NHL comparable for him.
Well, I don't think that he's going to have the block shots hits of Pietrangelo. He might. At this point, he hasn't shown that, but he may evolve into that. But I don't think that's really in his DNA. He's more of a pure puck mover than he is, bang and hit guys.
Yeah.
But you never know. He might evolve into that. It's possible.
Okay. This next guy he's one that I actually have some interest in is Axel Sandin Palika. Consensus rating or ranking is number 26. His pre-draft rank is number 9. The NHL comparable here is Noah Dobson. Craig Button had him as number 5 in his rankings, which I thought was really interesting, and he compared him to Sergei Zubov. He said he was the best defenseman in this draft. How do you view Palika right now?
Well, far be it from me to disagree with him, but I would not say that. No, I don't think he's the best defenseman. Some people might think he's the best fantasy defenseman, and that may be true, but ASP, as we like to call him, Axel Sandin Pelika, he's got really good offense, but he's a little bit undersized, and his defensive play is average at best. So he needs to work on that. There's a couple of interesting guys that we could compare him to, like Nils Lundqvist and Victor Soderstrom, who are both, kind of undersized Swedish defensemen that move pretty well. But I think we can clearly see those guys had difficulty translating to the NHL. I think that they both probably are NHLers, but fringe-ish and definitely like not hitting their full potential. And that would be the worry with ASP. I think that Noah Dobson is a reasonable comparison. It took Dobson a bit of time to become relevant. He was drafted in 2018, and I think probably last season was his breakout. So that was 4 years.
Yep.
It could be that long for ASP or even longer. The one thing I will say, though, it's one thing I do through my Patreon at Fantasy Hockey Life is not only rank guys on upside, but look at their shots, hits, and blocks, which is kind of hard to find for some of these guys. And there are only 2 players in my top 50 that have elite bash, and that is Axel Sandin Pelika and Ryan Leonard. So I was surprised by that. Leonard, I figured. I think I, kind of was like, yeah, he's probably going to have that, and he did. But ASP, I did not expect to shoot, block, and hit that much, but he did. So, that kind of moves him up a little bit for me, just because that floor is really high. But I'm really worried about his NHL projectability. So that's why I currently have him at 16.
Okay, that's fair. Well, Ryan Leonard, that's a nice segue into our final guy in the top 10 here. So his top 50 rank is number 21, and his NHL comparable is Alex Tuck. How do you view that player?
I love Ryan Leonard. He's so awesome. He's, when you watch that line with Perreault and Smith, you have to wonder, like, was one of those guys really the driving force? Or are they just all kind of playing off each other so well, and it's so synergistic? And it's probably the latter, but if I had to pick one that was driving it, it's Ryan Leonard. He is so smart. I mentioned earlier, he's the reason Will Smith was able to be so adventurous and creative. Like, he was always there cleaning up the mess. He was always the responsible guy. And some may look at him and say, well, that's because he doesn't have as much skill. But I don't really think that's the case. He really showed a lot of it at times. And he's the guy that's going to will goals into the net when you need him to. There have been people mentioning, you said Alex Tuck. I think that's a reasonable comp. I think, he likes to model his game after the Kachucks. And of course, that is exciting, because if you could be anything like either of the Kachucks, you're loving life. He also looks a fair amount to me in some of these models, like Timo Meier. So, I mean, either of those are phenomenal. And the thing is that he has a really high floor in peripheral leagues because of his elite bash. And so even if he's scoring like 55, 60 points with, 2 hits a game, and even like close to a block per game as a forward with 3 shots, like, that's outrageous production, right? So his category coverage is going to be good. And I think that he can score up to like 70 plus points in the right situation. So I like Ryan Leonard. I would bank not only on the floor, but I think the upside is there. And in terms of like all these guys in the top 10, like, who is the most projectable to have like the longest career, like maybe outside of Bedard, you got to look at Ryan Leonard, because his game is so pro already. Like, he's just going to play forever and be really good, I think.
Okay. High praise for Leonard. I didn't expect that, actually. I may have asked you this already or alluded to it, but I know Bruce was kind of thinking of something along the same line. So just going back to Adam Fantilli here quick. So he's ranked at number 6 in the top 50 prospect rankings. You have him ranked at number 6. The consensus list has him at number 2. Are you bearish on Fantilli? I think you kind of maybe alluded to that already. Or are you just more intrigued by the players you have ahead of him, which includes Logan Cooley, Olin Zellweger, Mitch Goff, and Leo Carlson?
I think it's definitely a bit of the latter. I like Fantilli. I like his bash is pretty exceptional as well. It didn't quite qualify as elite, but it's really good. I think the way, even though I was talking about upside, and I do think Fantilli has a lot of upside, I think Mitch Goff's is higher. I like what I've seen from Logan Cooley. I just think he looks like a beast, and what he did in college this year was incredible. And him being a little bit younger too, there's a little bit more room for improvement. So I think those guys are kind of all in a relative tier, but I would definitely have Cooley and Mitchkov ahead of him. And then Zellweger, people are down on Zellweger. Like all my colleagues had him in the teens or 30s, and I don't understand it. Frankly, I think he's going to be amazing. He's going to 50, 60 points, like run a regular. I think some people are scared that he's undersized, but the guy's just so smart, and he's actually pretty good defensively, even though he's a little bit undersized. He's so good with his stick and gap control. Like he's just screams projectable to me too, especially in this new NHL that favors mobility and rush offense and moving the puck. I don't have concerns about Olen Zellweger. So, but yeah, it's not necessarily that I don't like Fantilli. I think those guys are kind of similar, and we also were supposed to rank on give extra points to defensemen. So that's part of the reason why Zellweger is so high.
Right. Okay, that's a good point. I forgot about that. Just a few more questions here for you. Are there any other sleepers, or are there any sleepers in this draft based on consensus rankings? Players that you may be bullish on that others are not. One player I looked at was Kobe Barlow, who his pre-draft rank is number 27, but I've seen him ranked between 10 and 16 on other lists as well. So any sleepers for us?
Yeah, Barlow's interesting. I mean, he definitely projects to be an NHLer. He's got a really good shot, pretty mature game. He needs to be a little bit, improve his playmaking a little bit. Right now, he kind of skates down, takes a shot. Like his game is pretty simple that way, and it works in the CHL. He needs to diversify that a little bit, and he probably can. So I mean, at worst, he's like a third line, 20 goal scorer, but at best, he could be 35 plus goals if he can, and especially with assists if he can round that out. I mentioned Grayson Sachin earlier. Grayson Sachin is my guy. He's currently 35 on EP's consensus. At Dobber, we had him 29, but he's as low as 47 on Craig Button's list, 80 on Bob McKenzie, and the Hockey News has him at 90. If you're getting Grayson Sachin at 90, that's absurd value. So
for sure,
I think he may actually go pretty late, and so like we were saying earlier, like massive value. I think the other two names I'll throw out, the small guys, Gavin Brindley, Jaden Perron, they are really small, and that is a bit prohibitive. But if they either grow or somehow manage to leverage their amazing skill, then they could really work out, because their skill is actually pretty elite, even compared to some of the top guys. It's just that they're so small, it seems hard to project them into an NHL lineup. So
right.
I would not take them super high, but if you have like a second round pick, or if you have a little bit later pick, they're definitely guys I would swing on, especially because you'll probably know relatively soon whether they are kind of continuing to move the needle or whether they're kind of stalling out.
Okay. These questions here I've got just are for fantasy hockey for next season specifically. So for season-long fantasy hockey drafts, which players' prospects have the ability to make an impact at the NHL level next season? Anyone else that we haven't talked about already? And I guess that includes all the guys in the top 50 and or the blue chippers list in the prospect report.
Yeah, there's a lot of guys. The guys on that list basically, but I would say Logan Stankoven, another small guy that might really do some things in Dallas. Simon Nemec in New Jersey. We mentioned Zellweger already. I've been seeing, just on that point, I've been seeing talk of people favoring Mintyukov, and I personally don't understand it. I think Zellweger is better. And when we had our Anaheim guest on, Lisa Dillman, asked her to look into her crystal ball 5 years from now who's running the top power play. She said Zellweger, for what it's worth. So
all right,
there's that. There's Kevin Korchinski. I mean, he could make the team out of camp in Chicago, and that could be pretty awesome playing with Bedard. There's probably my favorite is Yuri Kulich. If people haven't been paying attention, what Yuri Kulich did in the AHL this year was absolutely historic and absurd. He's basically did it as an 18, 19-year-old, and he was awesome for the Rochester Americans. And he's someone who, I mean, he was their third pick last year for Buffalo, and he's someone who could maybe even step into the Sabres lineup next year. His game is that mature and that good. So he's someone I would watch out for. Joachim Kamel, Miroshnichenko, who's coming to North America and probably plays in the AHL, but he might might play for the Caps. Fabian Lysell, Brendan Brisson. These are all guys who are pretty close to NHL already. Basically, those are some guys I would look at.
Okay. My last question here: who is your way too early Calder candidates for next season?
Oh my God, it's so early. I usually go on Keegan Karlsson and do a Calder episode in September. So you're asking me in June. It's like really,
it's early. It's way too early. Yeah, but if you had to pick right now, gun to your head,
it's probably Bedard. I mean, it's boring, but it's true. I think Fantilli could make a really good case, especially because I think Fantilli will have a whole lot more to work with if he does go to Anaheim.
right?
Or maybe if he goes to Columbus, I guess. Either way, I think he's going to have way more to work with than Bedard. But yeah, I like him. Last year, I like Eklund and Edvinsson. You know, I think you could even recycle those guys because they didn't really get the opportunity. So it's usually not the newly drafted guys, but this year is an exception. So I think the front runners are Bedard and Fantilli.
Okay. Do you, again, any weight to games played? I know that was a conversation with Ryan Nugent-Hopkins and Gabe Landeskog, Connor McDavid, same thing. Like, the Oilers can't seem to buy a Calder trophy. And so does longevity in that season matter to you? Or if a guy just has better points per game, better production per 60, whatever, can that guy win the Calder without the games played?
He probably cannot, but I do think that consideration. I thought Matt Boldy should have got more consideration, even though what he did in half a year. I thought this year what Matthias Michelli did in the time and what he had to work with in Anaheim should have gotten way more praise. Like, he had trash to work with in Arizona and he did amazing stuff. I mean, his rate stats were off the chart, especially considering not just the people he played with, but the time on ice and opportunity he had. So they really should get more consideration, but realistically, it usually goes to who puts up the most numbers, which means you have to play more games. So that is a factor. And so it's probably going to be the guy who plays, at least like 70 games.
Okay, I lied. So I got one more question. For the Calder Trophy this year, because I think the NHL Awards, are they next week?
Yeah, they're at Monday when I arrive. Yeah.
Yeah, so we got Stuart Skinner, Matty Beniers, and Owen Power. Who's taking the Calder Trophy this year?
I said at the beginning of the year that it would be Beniers, and I still think it'll be Beniers.
Okay. John, you're nodding in approval.
Yeah, I think it's going to be Beniers.
Okay. Bruce, what do you think?
I'm hoping Stewie wins it. Just me.
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
I think,
well, part of that discussion is who had the greatest impact on their team, right?
yeah, definitely. And that day I would say it would be Skinner, because the Oilers wouldn't even have made the playoffs if Skinner didn't play as well as he did.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I would, for that reason, I would have Stewart ahead too. But the voters look at all the production. But you're absolutely right. You take Beniers out of the Kraken lineup, and part of what made them so good is that everyone was good, everyone was valuable, everyone contributed, and so you could make the argument that he didn't. I mean, he probably did, but you could say he didn't have as much of an impact.
For sure. Okay, well, Victor, thank you very much for being here tonight. Really appreciate your time. Before we leave, I do just want to mention again, for our listeners, don't forget to enter into our Dobber Hockey Ultimate Fantasy Pack giveaway. So we got 5 packs to give away, which I said include the Dobber Hockey Prospect Report, the Fantasy Guide, the Midseason Fantasy Guide, and much more. Make sure you follow us on Twitter at FHHacks and Instagram at Fantasy Hockey Hacks. Like and share the post. Mention a friend who you think would benefit from one of those Ultimate Fantasy Packs, and then the winners will be announced on July 4th, on our July 4th recording. So, again, Victor, thanks a lot. Really appreciate your insight. It was a lot of fun having you on. Let our listeners know where can they find you and plug any other content you need to.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was a blast. You can follow me on Twitter at VictorNuno12, VICTORNUNO12. And you can also follow the shows that I'm on. So the Dobber Prospects Report at DPR_show and the Fantasy Hockey Life at Fan Hockey Life. So definitely check that out. iTunes, download. Please give us a 5-star review and you guys too. It really helps the podcast. If you're listening and enjoying, that's a simple thing you can do that really helps us all out. And so that would be wonderful if you did that. And definitely check out the shows if you don't listen to them already.
Awesome. Thanks, Victor. Guys, we'll be back again. Like I said, July 4th, we're going to cover off the NHL Awards and NHL Free Agency. So be sure to tune in for that. And agreed. I got to remember to ask for those reviews because I never do. So anyway, all right, guys. Take care. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye, Felicia.